Las Vegas, 1979. The desert air is warm even after sunset, and the strip glows like a river of gold cutting through the darkness. Neon lights shimmer against polished chrome, and limousines glide past crowds of tourists who stare upward in awe. Inside the lobby of the Stardust Hotel, chandeliers drip light across marble floors, reflecting the elegance that the city wants the world to believe it naturally possesses. But tonight, the luxury on display belongs to men who never appear on brochures. Two foreign gang envoys, one from Eastern Europe, the other from Southern Italy, step through the revolving doors. Their expressions are restrained, but their eyes reveal the truth. Nothing in their world prepared them for this. Back home, criminal life meant shadowed basements, safe houses, bribed border guards, and years living like fugitives under corrupt police forces. Here, they watch an American mob boss descend a glass elevator in a tailored suit that costs more than their apartments. The casino manager greets him with a handshake. A senator standing nearby nods in recognition. Waitresses part like a tide, dealers smile, customers step aside. Every movement in the building seems to adjust itself around him. To the foreign visitors, it feels impossible. Criminals are supposed to hide. Yet here, the American boss walks as if the entire hotel belongs to him. They exchange a glance, half awe, half disbelief, realizing they have stepped into a world where crime and luxury are inseparable, and neither of them can understand how such a world exists. Context/background, Section 1. To understand their shock, you must first understand the world they came from. In the decades following World War II, foreign criminal organizations evolved inside harsh political landscapes. In the Soviet Union, the underworld was forged inside labor camps, frozen gulags where survival was measured in inches and hours. Men who would later become vori v zakon, thieves-in-law, grew up sleeping on wooden planks, eating thin soup, and fighting over scraps. Criminal authority wasn't built on wealth, it was carved from scars and sharpened by violence. In southern Italy, the Ndrangheta and Camorra families lived under constant pressure from a government that oscillated between neglect and brutality. Many villages were poor, isolated, and economically abandoned. Bosses might have controlled territory, but they did not live like kings. They lived in modest houses, avoided public places, and traveled in battered cars to avoid police checkpoints. Wealth existed, but it was hidden, buried under layers of secrecy, often in offshore accounts or buried as cash in farmhouses. In Albania and the Balkans, decades of dictatorship meant the black market thrived in secrecy. Smuggling routes carved through mountains and abandoned factories. Leaders of these groups lived like ghosts, always moving, always watching, never trusting. Their luxury came not from gold watches or penthouses, but from simply staying alive another year. The idea of a criminal walking into a hotel lobby and being addressed by name? Unthinkable. Their worlds were built on paranoia, invisibility, and constant threat. A crime boss could be arrested, kidnapped, or killed simply for being seen. Power meant silence. Power meant fear. Power meant staying hidden in the cracks of society. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America was entering one of the wealthiest periods in modern history. A booming post-war economy had created glimmering cities, highways lined with billboards, and new industries filled with disposable income. Americans were buying cars, televisions, and vacations. And among them, quietly rising, quietly collecting, quietly expanding, the American Mafia was learning how to turn this prosperity into something unprecedented. Foreign gangs had heard stories, they'd seen tabloids. They decaught rumors of casinos, unions, and hotels owned by the mob. But stories are easy to dismiss. Stories can be exaggerated. Nothing prepared them for the reality. Before they stepped foot in America, most foreign gang leaders assumed American mobsters lived similarly to them. Hidden away, constantly escaping the authorities, always in fear of the next raid. They imagined cramped apartments, coded messages, shadowy hideouts. What they found instead was a world where criminal power was not just tolerated, it was woven into the architecture of American prosperity. In their countries, criminals lived in the shadows. In America, some seemed to live in the spotlight. The contrast felt not only unbelievable, but almost offensive. Nothing in their lives had suggested such a thing could be real. And yet, as they moved deeper into New York and Las Vegas, the gap between their assumptions and the truth widened into something far more dramatic. Context/background, Section 2, by the mid-20th century, the American Mafia wasn't simply an underworld organization. It had become an economic empire. The United States was built on booming industries: construction, trucking, shipping, entertainment, real estate, gambling, each one a doorway for organized crime. After the war, millions of dollars flowed into cities like New York, Chicago, and Miami. Hotels needed workers, docks needed loaders, casinos needed protection, and unions, flush with dues and political leverage, needed leadership. The mob provided that leadership. Through the Teamsters, the Mafia funneled millions into Las Vegas casinos, financing resorts that looked like palaces rising from the desert. Hotels didn't see mobsters as criminals, they saw them as investors. Politicians didn't avoid them, they sought their endorsements. Police didn't chase them, many were on their payrolls. In New York, mob bosses like Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano lived in mansions that foreign criminals mistook for diplomatic residences. They attended charity events, dined at elite restaurants, and wore handmade suits from European designers. Their cars were chauffeured, their businesses legitimate on paper, and their authority visible. To foreign gangs, this level of luxury didn't just seem abnormal, it seemed impossible. In Russia, a police captain could raid your apartment for a bribe. In Italy, government crackdowns could wipe out an entire clan in a month. In Albania, one wrong move meant exile, prison, or assassination. But in America, mob bosses seemed to move with confidence, protected by a society that depended on their money. Law enforcement corruption played a massive role. When police commanders, judges, and local politicians are tied to your payroll or connected to your businesses, the city becomes more than a home, it becomes a fortress. Foreign gangs noticed this immediately. Even in the 1970s and 80s, when surveillance increased, the American Mafia lived far more comfortably and publicly than any criminal organization overseas. Casinos offered them suites and credit lines. Restaurants reserved tables without being asked. Nightclubs shut down entire sections for their parties. Developers sought their funding. Hollywood filmed movies inspired by their lives. Luxury wasn't just an accessory. Luxury was part of the uniform. And when foreign criminals entered these environments for the first time, the realization hit hard. Americans had turned organized crime into a business empire. Not a secretive survival network, not a smuggling ring built out of desperation, but a parallel economy supported by unions, corporations, and politicians. This wasn't the underworld. This was another world entirely. And the shock foreign gangs felt would only intensify as they witnessed different layers of American mob luxury, the kind of layers that didn't exist back home in any form. The more they saw, the more unbelievable it became. Engels, Section 1, the first thing foreign gangs noticed was the wealth gap, so large it almost felt unreal. In Europe, South America, and the Soviet bloc, criminal power was often built in environments of poverty. Even wealthy foreign gang bosses lived cautiously. They hid their money, they rarely flaunted wealth publicly. A gold watch could get you arrested. A new car could draw attention. A large house could make you a target. But in America, wealth was the language of power. And mob bosses spoke it fluently. They owned restaurants, trucking companies, real estate firms, front businesses that earned millions. They didn't stash money in barns. They invested in skyscrapers. They didn't hide in basements, they owned nightclubs. Their families lived in affluent suburbs alongside doctors and lawyers. To foreign criminals, this level of integration, crime merging seamlessly with legitimate business, was shocking. It made American mob bosses feel less like fugitives and more like CEOs who happened to run criminal empires on the side. But the real disbelief came when they witnessed the political shield surrounding American mob bosses. In most parts of the world, criminals spend their lives avoiding the state. In America, mob bosses often worked with the state. They influenced elections, funded campaigns, and had mayors or congressmen who owed them favors. Police departments with decades of corruption relied on mob alliances for information, control, and under-the-table payments. For foreign gangs, this was the most incomprehensible part. Where they came from, the government hunted them. In America, parts of the government protected them. And then came another shock: the American media. Foreign countries didn't glamorize their criminals. There were no magazines featuring gang leaders, no movies romanticizing their lives, no songs celebrating their names. Crime was a stigma, something to hide. But in the United States, Hollywood transformed mobsters into icons. Public fascination with the mafia made their luxury seem mythical. Films like The Godfather and Mean Streets turned criminal power into cinematic beauty. Foreign gangs couldn't understand how a society could admire something that their countries condemned so fiercely. It wasn't just wealth. It wasn't just political protection. It wasn't just media glamour. It was the combination of all three, something no foreign gang had experienced in their own worlds. And the deeper they looked, the more extraordinary the American model appeared. Angle's Section 2, foreign gangs soon realized that behind the luxury was a unique economic system they had never encountered. American mobsters had access to industries that didn't exist in their home countries. Labor unions controlled billions in pension funds. Construction companies needed contracts. Casinos needed investors. Trucking monopolies required protection. Ports, docks, warehouses, each sector offered cash opportunities on a scale foreign criminals had never imagined. This wasn't smuggling livestock across a mountain border. This wasn't bribing a border guard. This was organized, industrialized profit, and with profit came social power. American bosses didn't just run neighborhoods, they influenced culture. They sponsored community events. Their names were whispered with admiration by local shop owners. They controlled entire blocks where business owners willingly paid for protection not out of fear, but because the mafia offered stability that even the government couldn't provide. Foreign criminals watched American bosses walk into restaurants and sit at tables that no one else could use. Chefs greeted them personally. Waiters memorized their preferences. Patrons quietly looked away, knowing who truly held influence in the room. Another shock came from comparing prisons. American mobsters often served time in facilities with relative comfort: libraries, recreational areas, inmate hierarchies that respected their positions. Foreign prisons, by contrast, were brutal, unsanitary, and ruled by violence. To a Russian or Balkan criminal, the idea of a mobster maintaining influence behind bars was unheard of. American luxury extended beyond the streets. It extended into every corner of their empire, even prison. Foreign gangs, witnessing all of this, started to question everything they thought they knew about power. And soon, they would see the moment that defined their understanding forever: the first time they saw American mob luxury up close, in person. Climax/turning point, Section 1, New York, mid-1980s. A group of Russian gang leaders, newly arrived through Brighton Beach, is invited to a private dinner at a Manhattan restaurant controlled by an Italian family. They expect a dimly lit back room, guarded doors, nervous waiters. Instead, they walk into a place resembling a high-end film set: white tablecloths, imported wine, live music, and a staff that treats the visiting boss as if he owns the establishment. The Russians watch a Gambino captain enter the room. The atmosphere shifts, not with fear, but with respect. The owner personally escorts him. Regular customers glance over, recognizing a man who embodies both danger and elegance. The captain sits at the head of a long table, a gold watch on his wrist, a custom suit tailored perfectly to his frame. To the Russians, this is unimaginable. Back home, a boss entering a public restaurant would draw unwanted attention, risking arrest or assassination. Here, it draws admiration. A week later, the same foreigners are escorted into a penthouse overlooking Central Park. The apartment spans an entire floor, furnished with imported marble, artwork, and a kitchen larger than many Eastern European homes. The American owner is a mob-connected businessman with political partners in City Hall. The foreign visitors exchange another stunned look. In their world, criminals hide in safe houses. In America, criminals own skyscraper views. And then came Las Vegas. When foreign gangs visited casinos controlled by the Chicago outfit, they saw luxury on a different scale. Hotel suites with private bars, pools reserved for high rollers, and security teams that treated mob bosses like royalty. Casino owners greeted them with smiles, comping rooms and extending credit lines without question. Everything felt unreal, like stepping into a palace built for men who lived above the law. This was the moment foreign gangs truly understood the power of American organized crime. It wasn't just money, it was acceptance, visibility, integration. A reality where a mob boss could dine with celebrities, shake hands with politicians, influence unions, own businesses, and still walk freely among the public as if nothing were wrong. It was a world built on confidence, confidence backed by decades of corruption, wealth, and structural influence. But the shock was about to shift into something else entirely. Because while foreign gangs marveled at this luxury, they also witnessed something the American mob could no longer see. The decline had already begun. Climax/turning point. Section 2, the luxury foreign gangs admired came with a hidden cost: exposure. As the 1980s moved into the 1990s, federal law enforcement began shifting its entire strategy. RICO laws, wiretaps, undercover investigations. The government finally had tools capable of dismantling organized crime from the inside. Foreign gangs arriving during this period watched something extraordinary. The same men who walked through casinos like kings suddenly found themselves cornered by indictments. Hidden microphones captured conversations that once seemed untouchable. Federal trials made headlines across the country. The Americans had built an empire of wealth, but with that wealth came visibility. And visibility made them targets. Foreign criminals watched as the FBI took down family after family. The concrete walls of the empire began to crack. A Gambino boss who once lived in a mansion was arrested leaving his driveway. A Chicago outfit leader who controlled casino money was sentenced after an undercover sting. Union leaders tied to the mob were exposed on national television. To foreign gangs, it felt like witnessing a kingdom crumble. They realized something the Americans had ignored: luxury creates attention. Attention destroys secrecy. Secrecy is the foundation of criminal survival. Everything they admired, mansions, casinos, political connections, was now becoming evidence. Luxury had given the American mob decades of power. Now it was giving prosecutors everything they needed to dismantle it. Foreign gangs, watching from the sidelines, understood that American luxury was both a strength and a fatal weakness, and they would carry that lesson back to their own countries. Aftermath, Section 1, the impact of this cultural shock didn't stay confined to observation. It influenced how foreign gangs evolved. Russian mob leaders, returning to post-Soviet chaos in the 1990s, began copying aspects of American mob luxury. They invested in nightclubs, casinos, and real estate, learning from the American model, but applying it to a lawless environment where oversight was weak and corruption widespread. Mexican cartels, seeing how American mobs used front businesses, began creating entire financial networks. Shell companies, banks, international real estate portfolios, to hide wealth more effectively than any previous criminal generation. Albanian groups adopted the idea of public presence, using restaurants and clubs as social hubs to gather influence, recruit members, and launder money. Foreign gangs didn't just admire American luxury, they adapted it, refined it, and scaled it. But they also learned from American mistakes. They understood that living like a king makes you a target, so they built hybrid lives, part luxury, part invisibility. They learned how to remain wealthy without becoming too public. The American mob taught them how to rise. The American mob also taught them how to fall. Aftermath, Section 2, by the early 2000s, the golden age of American mob luxury had faded. Federal pressure, surveillance technology, and internal betrayals shattered the invincibility once associated with the mafia. Foreign gangs filled the vacuum. The Russians dominated financial crime and cyber rackets. Albanians took control of sections of the East Coast underworld. Mexican cartels created multi-billion-dollar empires that dwarfed anything the American mob ever controlled. Asian triads and yakuza expanded globally, using sophisticated money routes. The balance of power shifted. American mob bosses once lived publicly, confident, wealthy, comfortable. Foreign gangs, learning from their fall, built empires hidden behind modern technology, offshore accounts, and decentralized networks. Luxury still existed, but it had changed. It was quieter, hidden, organized in ways American bosses had never considered. The world of organized crime was transformed, not by violence, not by territory, but by the lessons foreign gangs learned from the rise and fall of American mob luxury. Reflections/closure in the end, the shock foreign gangs felt wasn't simply about mansions or limousines or suites overlooking the Las Vegas Strip. It was about witnessing a world where criminal power blended seamlessly with legitimate society, a world that shouldn't exist, yet somehow did. The American mob embodied a paradox: criminals who lived like aristocrats, protected by a system that was supposed to oppose them. To foreigners, it felt like stepping into a dangerous dream built on wealth, influence, and illusion. But luxury is a mirror. It reflects strength only as long as its foundation remains unbroken. Foreign gangs learned that real power isn't always the one on display. Sometimes it is the shadow behind the curtain, the hand behind the bank transfer, the voice behind the encrypted message. The American mob lived loudly. Foreign gangs learned to live quietly. And in that contrast lies the final lesson: luxury can elevate an empire or expose it.